Bona tarda a tothom I benvingudes.
Good morning, everyone. You're welcome to this seminar about gender perspectives, the impacts and possible answers within the COVID-19 context. I am Sonia Ruiz, the Director of Time Policies and Gender Policies at the Barcelona City Council. Let me tell you about how this first web seminar will work. This session is broadcasted by streaming the YouTube Catalan Feminism and LGTBI from the Barcelona City Council. This webinar is the first of the two that we have organized about this subject with two parts. Firstly, Sara Berbel will make the opening and we will have a couple of talks, a couple of conferences within a debate space, and we will have finally Laia Grau, the urbanism director. You will be able to send us all your comments and questions through the chat. Marc Camarasa, the staff technician, to whom I want to thank for the organization of these two webinars, and myself, we are going to share your questions, your comments with the speakers so they can answer. From now, we are grateful and thankful for your participation, and we hope you will enjoy this session. I will give the floor to Sara Berbel, Principal Director, for the opening of this webinar. Thank you and have a nice seminar. Hello, thank you very much, Sonia. Congratulations for this initiative of creating this great cycle of webinars that I am presenting. As you might know, there are two webinars where we want to analyze from a gender perspective which are the effects of gentrification. We want to know the effects, but mostly how we can prevent them and how we can answer and face these effects. How can we improve our cities? From our city council, we think that the cities are not neutral, are not gender neutral. There are some biases as for the users of the city, and also what has to do with the freedom and rights of women. There are plenty of inequalities which are conditioning and having an impact on a daily basis for women. Unfortunately, not only it does affect Barcelona, but it is also affecting and having an impact on many worldwide cities. Curiously, or not that curiously, we should say, because we know that it is more used than what we would want. This has been very little studied, or the associated displacements, the links on how this affects and has an impact on women. From the Barcelona City Council, we wanted to talk about this invisibility, and that's why we commissioned a couple of studies, a couple of surveys that will be presented afterwards. It is very interesting to share these thoughts with you, taking into account that we wanted to work together with the Academy. The Academy, we will learn and listen to you, but we want also public policies for administration as well as activism and associations that we know they are participating in this meeting. We want to take into account these three shareholders. We have the urban geographer, Dr. Winifred Curran, who I will introduce in some minutes, as well as Toni López Gay, him and his team. With this survey, they have studied the implications, the involvement of these different gentrification studies between 2011 and 2018. And I'm not talking about the past, I am talking about this recent period, which is conditioning all what we are living through. It has used a quantitative methodology and from some variables such as sex and age, the level of studies. They have analyzed the relationship between gender, sex, migration, movements and displacements, and the economic effort, in particular that of women to have an access to housing. This shows some vulnerabilities, and it is very relevant to put some light on top. We also have some observers who will tell us about a qualitative survey, and we will know about resistance and resilience experiences from other cities such as Barcelona, Madrid, or Vienna. For today, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Winifred Curran, who is a doctor in geography at the Clark University and at the DePaul University of Chicago. She has a long experience in the study of gentrification, and I will underline Gender and Gentrification, which was published in 2018. I think today she will tackle the daily experiences of women within these gentrification processes in the cities. Her look is very diverse and very wide. She talks about housing as well as labor opportunities, mobility, caregivers' options. So all these women are not invisible anymore, but it is much better that she tells us herself with her own words. Dr. Curran, you have the floor whenever you want.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Thank you for having me. I have to say it's really wonderful to participate in a conversation like this, to see a city government paying attention to issues around gender. That is not something that American cities are tackling right now. So it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about these issues with you. Thanks for the invitation. And so really one of my kind of central points in this work around gender and gentrification is to make the point that gender is another point of vulnerability when gentrification comes to cities, that because of the nature of the gender division of labor and of the gendered wage gap, that women are more vulnerable to displacement from gentrification than men. And that this is, there's nothing kind of biological about this. It really is about the existing economic political structures that reinforce these gender divisions. So first is, of course, that housing is the main issue that gentrification research has focused on, right? That's kind of where we see the impact of gentrification most explicitly. So part of the reason for this is that the central city becomes more attractive both to gentrifiers, but also to single heads of households, women who are single heads of households, and both are attracted to the center of the city for the same reasons, right? To have access to a diversity of services, a diversity of housing types, to be able to engage in the work-life balance that's necessary if you are a single head of household. So we have often it's gentrifier women who are displacing other long-term residents who are women because they're both looking for the same kind of suite of services to be available to them. And so this competition increases the cost of housing for residents who have been in the city for many years. And that's really the central crux of gentrification, is not just the parts of the city may become upgraded and new businesses open, but really what's central to certainly my research in gentrification is that the experience of displacement is central to it, right? So this competition over housing leads to the displacement of women, especially women who have caregiver roles. right? Because the gender division of labor that I talked about is intimately related to the wage gap, the gendered wage gap, because women engage, again, overwhelmingly women, it doesn't only have to be women, but typically that is the gender division of labor, that women often are either part-time in the labor force or are in and out of the labor force because of their care responsibilities. So it is that gender division of labor which then exacerbates the gendered wage gap. So that makes women then less able to participate in the competition over that housing at the center of the city that can result in that displacement, right? That then makes it much more difficult to find other housing in the city. So especially if women are caregivers of children, landlords often don't like children in their buildings, right? Children can be, loud, they can be messy, they don't necessarily lead to an increase in value in the property. So women who are looking for housing, and again, even if they're not single heads of households, typically it is women who have the familial responsibility of being the ones who are out there looking for housing. So that burden falls on women, and it is much more difficult when children are involved. That competition for housing that is affordable, but also housing that is big enough, right? Housing that is flexible enough to accommodate a family, perhaps often a multi-generational family. As cities become gentrified, we see fewer and fewer of those types of housing. We see the rise of studio apartments, 1 or maybe 2 bedrooms at the most, not housing that's really built to accommodate families. So that's one of the big issues. Then there's the issue of the kind of services that women are, and especially women acting as caregivers to children, are looking for in the city. So that we see often that single female heads of households will be paying much more of their income for rent in order to be able to stay in neighborhoods that they deem desirable for a host of reasons. One is often the ability of their children to stay in the schools where they have already been. So if they value that school community, if they value the quality of the school that their children have been in, women will work harder, will take on a higher burden of rent in order to be able to maintain that kind of quality of life for their children in relationship to the school community. Another reason that we see women paying much more for housing is safety, right? That if women perceive a neighborhood as being a safe neighborhood, they are much more willing to pay more for that safety, right? Because women are taught to feel unsafe in public space, they then feel the necessity to pay more in rent in order to stay in housing that they consider to be safe. Another safety issue that women are dealing with when it comes to housing is that of domestic violence. That women are much more susceptible to the cost of housing when they don't have the same sort of financial independence as men. And so often women will stay with their abusers in order not to lose their housing, because they know that they can't afford the housing on the open market, right, without the financial support of that partner. So that's an issue that we are increasingly seeing, is women forced to stay with abusers in order to avoid homelessness. So all these issues of safety kind of come together that are intimately involved with women's experience, not just of everyday life in the city, but in terms of what areas of housing are available to them. And then specifically when it comes to housing, another particular group that's extremely vulnerable when gentrification starts is the elderly. And of course, women are overrepresented in the elderly population because they tend to live longer. And the elderly we see are often targeted by real estate developers and speculators, so that older people basically are hounded by speculators, people looking to purchase their homes, or people who are calling in various building code violations and those sorts of things, which racks up fines and pushes elderly people out of their home. And those who have done research on this find that elderly people, so again, women will be overrepresented here, who are pushed out of their homes in this way, tend to die relatively soon after their displacement. that experience is profoundly disruptive, and therefore can be a matter of life or death for elderly people. So this kind of suite of issues around gender and housing is one kind of leg of the vulnerability that gender represents in gentrified parts of the city, and that this is part of the larger kind of host of issues that happens in a neighborhood when gentrification occurs, so that even there's so many changes in the neighborhood that even when someone may be able to stay in their neighborhood, right, if they're able to pay those higher rents, they're not immediately displaced from their homes, there is still a whole host of other displacements that occur in a gentrifying neighborhood, right? So that people who are able to stay, maybe they're able to stay, but their social networks often are not, right? So perhaps grandparents may be displaced, babysitters, other family members who were relied on for childcare or elder care. That kind of social network that helped make the kind of balance of care work and work possible in the center city may become lost because of gentrification. It becomes more expensive not just to rent in gentrified neighborhoods, but to do everything else, right? Stores, long-term stores that may have been more affordable may be displaced, and the businesses that replace them are more expensive. So that kind of day-to-day, everyday necessities become much more expensive in gentrified neighborhoods. Service providers may become displaced. Everything from childcare centers, doctors, to social service organizations, non-governmental organizations that perhaps were a part of the fabric of the long-term neighborhood, we often see being displaced in gentrified neighborhoods because they too are not able to afford rising rents. I mentioned before schools, how women are often much more willing to pay more to stay in a neighborhood in order to keep their children in the same school. But that school community may change, right? As the neighborhood becomes gentrified, the school may also become gentrified. And so the kind of parent organizations that operate in the school will become quite different, right? Their concerns may be different depending on their socioeconomic status. So that can feel like another form of displacement. And then there's the matter of kind of displacement from the democratic process of the neighborhood, that as the demographics of the neighborhood change, who the community groups are may change, right? There may be, gentrifiers often come in and start their own community groups that tend to be taken very seriously because they have political clout, because of their economic standing. So that long-term residents can feel themselves also displaced from the democratic process for how change is happening in their neighborhood, right? So that connection to housing is not just about the ability to stay put in housing, but about how the neighborhood around around your housing changes and makes you feel unwelcome, even in your home, right? Even in the place that you have understood to be home. So that's kind of one element I want to highlight, that kind of housing, everyday life connection. The next big issue I want to highlight is that of work, right, of the labor market. The gentrification changes labor markets, right? Gentrification is very much the result of the globalization of the world economy, the decline of industry, the rise of service sector, and that kind of bifurcation in the labor force, right? That gentrifiers working in high-end white-collar jobs, high-end service industry jobs, require a whole host of low-wage service sector jobs, many of which tend to be gendered in terms of who does that work. So, the babysitters and the nannies, the au pairs, the cleaners, restaurant workers, home health aides. These are all areas of the labor market that are often gendered, that it is women, often immigrant women, who are doing this work. But also it's work that kind of by definition is not paid very well, in part because gentrifiers themselves are the ones, for example, paying babysitters and nannies. And so the pay for those childcare workers has to be low enough to justify the mother being able to go out and work in the labor force. And since women are paid less in the labor force to begin with, they then have to kind of push that wage gap down to their service workers, right? So there is that inequity that's kind of built into the labor force. It also can change the nature of the labor force within neighborhoods. So, for example, we've seen gentrification in a lot of neighborhoods that had previously had a very strong industrial economy, right? Sometimes, obviously, deindustrialization is a global phenomenon, but sometimes the gentrification of cities also causes deindustrialization, right? That as industrial business owners realize that they can use their property, for example, for loft apartments rather than for active industry becomes displaced. Therefore, the people who work for those industries become displaced. And depending on the industry, women are often pretty heavily represented in industry labor forces. So that kind of economic change as to what the driver of the local economy is has a rippled effect in terms of gender. And then, of course, there's the nature of care work, right? That gender division of labor that I've touched upon already, that limits the ability to which those women who are involved in care work are able to participate in the labor force and where they can participate in the labor force. So, for example, often women with small children will not be able to commute for very long distances because they have to be able to get home to pick up children from school, or at least be close if something goes wrong and children need to be picked up. Women with caregiving responsibilities of the elderly, again, can't be commuting 1 to 2 to 3 hours every day because they have to be in the immediate vicinity in order to do that care work. So that dual responsibility quite literally limits the spatial extent in which women can look for employment, and therefore may limit their employment opportunities and also the pay of the jobs that they are able to get. So that employment part of the equation in gentrification is one that I find has been underexplored in terms of the effect that gentrification has not just on housing markets, as we've already discussed, but on labor markets as well. And then the last major kind of aspect that I want to focus on is public space and access to public space. And so we know that cities were built by men, right? They were organized, planned by men with an assumption of how people would use public space, would use urban space. That doesn't take a lot of care work into account. A lot of cities are based on the assumption that people are commuting from, a 9 to 5 workday or whatever the standard workday is. So those kind of patterns of where is public transit invested in, where are roads heavily invested in, where do we put our infrastructure dollars, are not often considering the ways in which, residential and commercial neighborhoods are connected, the multiple stops and multiple responsibilities that, again, women who are in caregiver roles have to engage in, so that it's not as kind of simple and infrastructural kind of balancing of go to downtown, come home, and that's the end of the equation. Next, of course, is when you're out in public space, how safe you feel in public space. And so this again goes back to something I talked about in the housing section, is as neighborhoods change, women especially may feel less safe in those neighborhoods. One of the things that we are kind of taught to understand about what gentrification does is that it makes cities safer. That's not necessarily the case, because for a few reasons. One is sort of who's gentrifying. So in neighborhoods where the drivers are maybe, wealthier people with children, perhaps there is a safety benefit that comes from that. But in many gentrified neighborhoods, what we're seeing is a lot of single people coming in, a lot of kind of, drug tourists and that kind of experience, a lot of bars and restaurants opening up, so that the way in which people are using public space is not necessarily a way that is going to make women feel safer in that space. Right, we might see a lot more street harassment, for example, if you've got drunk people on the streets coming out of bars and restaurants at all hours of the day and night. Another element, of course, is that women as parents may be concerned about the way in which their children are being policed in gentrified neighborhoods, right? So often we see that the police presence becomes much more intense as neighborhoods gentrify, so that the gentrifiers experience the neighborhood as safer. But this can also mean the targeting of youth of color, of immigrant youth, so that the neighborhood can feel far less safe to them and their families. Then there's, of course, the issue of how welcome people feel in public space when they are understood to be different from how the neighborhood is changing, right? So how, as these new businesses come in, new housing types are built, how welcome are the long-term residents? How welcome are women who have care responsibilities, especially of young children, in a neighborhood that's being gentrified by single people who don't have children, right? Who don't have those responsibilities. How much does it make the kind of day-to-day management and balancing of work and life more difficult when the kind of basic lived experience is that long-term residents increasingly feel out of place because of the way that the neighborhood is changing. And I just want to kind of finish up in terms of the effects by thinking about all this kind of suite of displacements that people are experiencing in gentrified neighborhoods that impact on people that goes beyond just perhaps a physical displacement from home, but that there are obviously mental and physical health effects of these changes, right? That the stress of worrying about all these issues all the time is a burden that's often borne most heavily by women, and especially women in caregiving roles. That is no easy thing to be balancing all of these concerns all of the time. And so that's also something that deserves a lot more attention, is the kind of public health impact that gentrification can impart on the people experiencing these multiple displacements. And maybe just to end on a slightly more hopeful note of that there are things that we can do about this, right? There's nothing inevitable about any of these displacements and experiences, right? All of these things are things that we can do something about, and that anything that we do to improve, issues around housing affordability, about access to schooling, access to public health, will help women, right? So there's nothing about policies around these issues that necessarily has to be about just gender. That sort of good public policy, broadly based, will help women in this situation. So, for example, a much stronger public investment in social housing, right? Women are overrepresented in social housing, again, because of their need for affordable housing and their lack of the same kind of economic resources that men often have. So any investment in social housing and other forms of affordable housing is going to be something that helps women, right? Any investment in childcare, right, in schools, that makes childcare and schooling affordable, reliable, and high quality is going to be something that helps women. When it comes to housing stock, right, looking at housing types that are flexible and allows a kind of diversity of family types, that is something that is going to help women. Looking at transit planning, right, and understanding that people make multiple stops in their work, and that sort of straight lines, and when it comes to transit planning, don't necessarily serve everyone's needs. So looking at ways to make transit more accessible across space is something that helps women. And finally, anything that makes the city feel safer, right, which does not necessarily mean an increase in policing, but things that make people, and especially women, feel safer in public space, is going to be something that benefits everybody. So a focus on gender is not just about gender, it's about making a city that is accessible and feels equitable to everyone. Thanks so much.
After this very interesting talk, thank you very much, Winifred. I am sure that all those who could hear this talk, you will have comments, you will want to add upon this. I remind you that it will be after the second presentation. Let me introduce the second reporter, Sarah Belbel, to say some things about this, as well as Toni López Gay. He's a researcher at the Geography Department of the UAB and the Demographics Center of Studies, and Within his research, he focused on the urban processes vis-à-vis the dynamics of populations, mostly as for residential mobility displacements. He has studied on gentrification processes in Barcelona and as well as touristic gentrification and transnational gentrification. From the Barcelona City Council, we commissioned him and his team a survey called Gentrification in Barcelona from a gender perspective, a quantitative approach. And this survey has been pioneered with no precedence in the Spanish states, and we will give Toni the floor. Hello, good evening, everyone. Let me thank the Transversality Department of the Barcelona City Council, not only for the preparation of this seminar, for this research line, as we could see in the city. Basically, I'm going to share the screen so you can all see it. Within the next 15 minutes, I will talk about this quantitative part of the results of our survey, together with the Department of Geography of the Universitat Autònoma. I know that these data might be a bit heavy at this time of the evening. But this has been a challenge. There was this quantitative look. Let me tell you about the antecedents of the work, the public order, the public and for the elaboration of this gentrification and gender study, which is online with most synthetic population. This has allowed us to make this gentrification and gender survey. We went deep in these gender issues. It was a perfect subject. After this excellent presentation by Winifred Curran, there is a theoretic line within the last 15 years deepening into this gentrification perspective and how some groups are particularly vulnerable within these gentrification processes. There is much theory around this, as well as very few quantitative works as a reference. As Sonia just said, we explore and inhospit field, bringing our contributions. The context is quite hard as for changes in gentrification processes, residential displacements. As Winifred said in the beginning, there is an expansion of central areas which are more and more exclusive, and the people with less resources are displaced outside the outskirts of the cities or far away. Barcelona has been marked by this increase of rental prices since 2014. Before this decade, these processes were more located in very particular locations in historical areas. With this increase of prices, this has reached many areas of the city. The metro, you can hear many people saying, well, I have to get out of the city because I can't afford my rental prices. Our survey is a bit wider. We are going to answer to 4 of these questions with some data. All the overlapping layers within this process is what can we answer with the data we have. We can see whether there are more women or more men in gentrified areas, or is it the opposite? Is it a unidirectional relationship? What happens with mobility and migration between women and men? Which other layers explain this different mobility? What has been the evolution, and which is the efforts made by this housing to face housing fees, housing costs? And the fourth question, which was the latter, that's about the effort of these housings to face these housing costs. Which are the main trends, and what can't we know? The data are what they are. We don't know the reasons of the housing changes. We do not say why we were displacing ourselves because we have a child. We know that mobility, residential mobility, relies on a huge diversity of factors, which is often linked to the individual and family life cycle. Let's analyze the results. We can see what happens in gentrified areas. That's research that we undertook with the geography department in the Agency of Public Health in Barcelona, and we wanted to see some dimensions. There was a dichotomy between gentrified areas, the most consolidated ones, those who could be more gentrified, such as Sant Antoni, Gracia, Barceloneta, and others more emerging, that we didn't know that they would become gentrified, such as Raval, Poblenou, and other areas. But we are going to analyze these 18 areas. The first questions, are there more women than men? In Barcelona, we have more women than men. For each 100 men, we have 111 women. This is different behavior of residential behavior, but that's about life expectancy of women, which is greater. So we have the areas where the people are elder, so there are more women. To deep on this, to dig on these differential items, the analysis group, we analyzed the group of aged between 25 and 49 years. Within this group, the relationship that we could see, if there was not this strange behavior in each area, we should have 95.6 women per each 100 men. Okay, this first chart that I show you is saying that in green areas there are more women than men. In the red areas there are more men than women. The relationship is in favor of women in green, and in red that's in favor of men. That's gentrification according to success. In Gràcia, Sarrià, Sant Gervasi i Galbany, there is a huge presence of women, whilst in Ciutat Vella, Sant Antoni, there are fewer women than men. Anyone could say, well, there is another layer which is essential to understand this. There are other layers, the origin of population, socioeconomic condition of people. Let's deep into that. We have these two graphs where we can analyze this sex relationship between men and women from population in Barcelona and those born in richer countries. We can see a huge diversity. Gentrification doesn't mean that the sex relationship is unidirectional. We have the area of Gracia. For 100 men, there are 103 women. And Barceloneta, the relationship is in favor of men. There has been differential behavior. In Barceloneta, for example, with fewer women, whilst women coming from richer countries, the relationship is in favor of women. 100 men, 103 women born in richer countries. The relationship between gentrification and gender is not unidirectional. There are many layers and a strong territorial heterogeneity. Gentrificated areas with a strong presence of women. But we also want to see how this relationship between genders has evolved through years. If we have a look at those born in Barcelona, this relationship is less favorable to women than at the beginning of this decade. In the population from richer countries, the sex relationship is mostly in favor of them, in favor of women. This has worsened between 2011 and 2018. Sant Pere Caterina de Ribera, 0.94 women to 0.85. Sant Antoni and Pobla Seca. Barceloneta, as for women born in richer countries, we have a Barceloneta which is more balanced and we have more women than men in the age of 25-49 years. Let's see the different behaviors in terms of residential mobility. I won't show you graphs because there are many of them, but some conclusions. What has happened vis-a-vis the entry flow? Basically, we can see that there is an internationalization and more elitization of the profile. 45% of income flows are made by people born in foreign countries with university studies. Between those born in Spain, there are more and more women, and population born in Spain, the increase of entry flow has been notably superior between men. As for the exit groups, there is a displacement of population. That's the huge question. It is very difficult to state something clear because there are many movements. We can observe a decrease of the movements between the same areas This has decreased during this decade, and on the contrary, we have more movements towards other areas with worse incomes. When we are talking of masculine population and feminine population, we could see an increase of the weight of movements to other municipalities, which is superior. The results are much more clear for the other collective, such as people with superior studies, maybe amongst the population born in Spain, as we could say, more difficulties to remain in the same area. That means a substitution of a replacement of the population, masculine and feminine population living in the city. We can see that there is a feminization, but mostly a clear substitutions. The younger women born abroad with higher studies are gaining weight more and more. This group are being reinforced. In gentrificated areas, the presence of women has been higher. And a conclusion: to understand this process from a gender perspective, we have to assume its complexity within the composition of female composition, according to origin, with different aspirations, preferences, and residential strategies. We've seen all the movements from the population without knowing whether they were being displaced with their housemate. Let's have a look at a single parent household, or just a single adult households. Let's start by single adult households. As Winifred said, these areas are preferred for the settlement of this type of housings. During the decade, there are more women than men, and some more men than women. For these decades, that's the graph on the right, you can see that the increase has been under the single adult men households. We are going to have a look at the efforts made by women to face house costs. We want to refer to a vulnerable group, which are the elder. Basically, as you can see on this evolution graph, the single adult women household has evolved. There are less housings of that kind, whilst in the emerging and consolidating areas, it was the contrary. We don't want to forget these single mother households, which were increasingly growing within this line of more difficulties to remain. These single adult women households. And the last questions to sum up all this, which are the efforts to face all these housing costs. How all this has a repercussion on what we have to face, the efforts made to live in these housings linked to the schooling of kids, social relationships, family relationships, and so on. First, I want to tell you that the women living in single-adult households are paying more vis-à-vis the men and vis-à-vis the other women living in other areas. 80% of women who live in this kind of housings do have to face mortgages or renters. There is a difference of 5% regarding men. They are paying 8% more than what other women are doing in the rest of the city. That's important. If we have a look at this 80% of women, 75% of men, which is the efforts, what out of their income is allocated to pay the rentals. 40% of income are allocated to pay for the housing. In the case of men, 7% less. It is linked to the lower income of women. The income being lower is 7 points superior than men, as well as the neighbors. Also, the elder are doing much more efforts. We do not have data about this. And this last slide, we can see through this analysis, we can see the vulnerability of female women that we can sum up having to face these costs. And if you have questions, I think we still have 30 minutes to talk about that. Thank you. Thank you very much, Toni, for your presentation. This has been a study with very much interesting data, with very complex at the same time. This week, we are going to put this survey on the Barcelona City Council in case you want to see all that. And after these two presentations, we are going to open the floor so you can all participate. Remember that you can ask your questions from the YouTube chat. Which questions do we have until now? Yes, we have some questions. I am going to group them in three. The first question by Diego Jesus Maldonado, directly in English.
Have women in gentrifying neighborhoods less social cohesion than in non-gentrifying ones? Yes. Is this because of the population displacement and the continuous population turnover?
The second question, Esther Cruzellas, about the effects of gentrification. The question is, does it attract women from rich countries? And the third question, which is more technical, I am answering myself. Someone is asking whether the translation will be available into English. From Toni López presentation, yes. So we had this technical issue, but this translation will also be available in English and in Catalan in YouTube. So now Winifred or Toni, whoever wants to answer.
So could you just repeat the first question? You were breaking up a little bit for my connection, so I didn't hear the first question.
Have women in gentrifying neighborhoods less social cohesion than in non-gentrifying?
Well, I think that's one of the dangers, right? That that women, especially again single heads of households, have a network, right? Kind of like an informal safety network that they rely on in order to balance all the things that there are to balance. And that as gentrification happens, even if they themselves are able to stay in their neighborhood, they become that network gets displaced. And so then they may feel that that lack of social cohesion because they don't necessarily have the connections with the in-movers, right? Because they have different socioeconomic status, different jobs, just a whole host of different experiences. On the flip side, I mean, that it doesn't have to be that way. So Damaris Rose, who's a Canadian geographer, had hypothesized the marginal gentrifier, the idea that many female gentrifiers may actually be kind of closer to the situation of long-term female heads of households than other typical gentrifiers, right? That kind of, if you will, there's like a sisterhood of single mothers. So whether the single mother is a gentrifier or a long-term resident who's feeling that pressure, that there may be points of connection there. And I think that actually is one place that we should really look for organizing, for ways to build up that kind of social safety net. But often there's also a big kind of class barrier there as well. So it's certainly not guaranteed, but I think we should look. I think that's one thing that a focus on gender gets us, that if gentrifiers, again, gentrifying women can see their, a sense of connection with those other women living in the neighborhood, rather than more of a loyalty to their class position, then that's an opportunity for organizing there.
Contestaré al Diego en castellà, que em penso que m'entén una miqueta millor en castellà.
I will answer Diego in Spanish.
No hemos podido profundizar, ¿no? Al ser muy cuantitativo, pero parece
We
que
couldn't
puede haber una
deep
relación,
into our survey because it
bastante
was
clara, ¿no?
rather quantitative, but there is a clear relationship. I will base myself on some quantitative evidences from other studies about social cohesion in other areas of the city. In our city, we go through several processes. We have tourism, which concentrate on specific areas of the city. And this is a challenge to this social cohesion, because there are people who come just for a while, for some hours. As we can see, there is a link in, if we study these areas with much more populated, or people who just spend a few months, so they are not creating roots in their areas. And that's where we observe that the sex relationship is more favorable to women in those areas. I think that in 15 days, in the second part of the seminar, we are going to deep into that through the qualitative work, where we will be asking for this social cohesion, to which extent this helps women root more within the city. I think it is an important item. And as for the next question, whether gentrification is attracting women from rich countries, from wealthy countries, it is a process with goes and backs. I mean, women from the wealthiest countries, they tend to focus on the areas where they can find the services they need for. So they first see and look for these wealthiest areas of the city, where they will find these babysitting services or these safeguard cities or whatever. And at the same time, these processes of gentrifications are increased by that. Gentrification is attracting its group of people, and at the same time, they are fostering these processes of gentrification.
Molt bé. Ara tenim una altra pregunta per les dues ponents que ens diu que si poguéssiu
Another question
aconseguir aquelles dades
for both of you.
en un món
In
ideal,
an idea
qualsevol tipus de
world,
dades que poguessin
if we could get the necessary data to analyze gentrification and gender, which data would you ask it?
What the ideal data would be. I think in many ways we have the data, right? We know there is a gendered wage gap. We know that there is an unequal gendered division of labor. I think the difficulty with measuring gender specifically in gentrification is that unlike other variables that we may look at in gentrified neighborhoods like race, you're not going to see that same kind of difference because most households will have women in them, right? So, it's not possible to segregate women the same way, an immigrant population may be segregated in a certain part of the city, right? Any family at some point in time is going to need a woman in it, right? So I think it's difficult to kind of map those differences in the same way we might do, for economic status or racial status or something like that. And I think there's these inequities are not just within households. So it's pretty clear, right? And Toni's data shows really clearly how much more women are paying for housing, right? How a greater percentage of income for housing. And that's really important to note. But that those same inequalities can exist even within families, right? So that even looking at household data may not be getting at the gendered inequalities. So I'm not sure that we kind of get the answer from just quantitative data, right? As for most things, right? That sometimes the data just isn't there in a way that is going to make the case really clear and easy. And that's why, sort of listen, because also much of this is not so clear cut of like, if your rent is this much, you're burdened, but if it's $1 less, you're not, right? Sometimes those quantitative categories may not be so clear, right? It can be different based on people's circumstances. And so I think the experiential aspect of this is very important because we're not going to be able to measure things like how safe women feel in a neighborhood, right? We can measure, crimes and where they occur, but for example, sexual harassment, especially street harassment, is not something that tends to get reported. And so that we have a sense of where it is and how it's happening differently in different places. So it would be great to have more data, but I'm not sure that even that would kind of get us to the now we have the data, here is the answer. Unfortunately, it's much more complicated than that.
I totally agree with what Winifred was saying. About quantitative data, we often can't know, but yes, we can about some of these data. That's mostly a couple of wishes. First, the size of the housing. All the studies are individual and we don't know whether this person is displacing himself, we don't know about the size of the flat. We don't know whether we are talking of a student flat. And another thing would be the previous situation, the previous state. That means her residential and migration past. And this data can be studied in Northern Europe when they are doing these surveys about gentrification. They do have these surveys, this data. So I wish geographs and demographs would have this data beyond, that means biographic data, which are not always available. Also, a wish that might be unwishable, but it is true that through the survey, socio-demographic survey in 2017 in Barcelona, the truth is that this poll made in Barcelona is helpful to know about this income of people. We have a housing income, not per person, okay? Not ventilated, but this research was very helpful to our research. In ideal world, it would have been great to get more data, more specific data, so we would have been able to analyze specific areas to establish better comparisons. But this kind of polls could help us to get into more details. And as Winifred said, the qualitative work is paramount to be able to be more specific and to be closer to the truth. Another question from Mr. Cruzellas, who is asking, within this pandemic context, how can this situation be modified? As Toni said, these results that you got, do you think that through this pandemic period, all this has been modified? And in the case of Winifred, more in general terms, do you think that these street dynamics in the public space, from this gender perspective within this pandemic period, having or being obliged to wear masks for social distancing and all that, to which extent this has changed through COVID-19?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I don't think there's one answer to that question, right? I think we've seen different versions. So I know, so early on, and I think through the summer, there was almost some hope maybe around how the pandemic might affect gentrification, that we saw a lot of upper income people leaving cities, right? Going to places that were less densely populated in order to escape the virus. And that with the ease, relatively speaking, of remote work, that maybe they wouldn't come back, and that this might relieve gentrification pressure on cities. At the same time, we're also seeing that the people who were most vulnerable to begin with are now, that vulnerability has been even increased more, right? And I know especially in American cities, we are expecting an eviction crisis any minute, right? That there are government provisions to prevent evictions to varying degrees through the end of the year, but that people then expect a huge wave of evictions after that. And again, women-headed households being the most vulnerable, they are most likely to be evicted. And that then real estate speculators can scoop up large amounts of property, much as was the case after the Great Recession, and just kind of sit on it, hold on to it until the pandemic ends and that demand returns to cities. So I think there are points of hope in that if people are leaving cities, again, the kind of wealthy, global gentrifier who's not committed to a particular neighborhood, but is kind of just looking for the best quality of life for that moment, that if that relieves some pressure, that could be potentially hopeful. I think there has been a rise in mutual aid kind of organizing in cities as a result of the pandemic that has kind of built up some of that social network that we were talking about with the first question. So I think there's some hope in that as well for people to sort of reimagine how we live in cities and how we care for each other in cities. But I think there's a whole global real estate structure that's not going to really enjoy that aspect of pandemic urban life. And then specifically for kind of the day-to-day, I think, and obviously this experience would be different in many cities, but I feel like often the mask wearing can make people feel even more separate from each other than they did before. And so I wonder if that kind of makes us feel more isolated and kind of to keep ourselves safe in our own little cocoons in a way that is even more than it was before, but which perhaps may then also, I don't know, I haven't had this experience myself as to whether it cuts down on street harassment and that sort of thing, because just there are fewer interactions to begin with because people feel that way that they need to be that way to stay safe. But I would hope, certainly there are inklings of people being more conscious of taking care, which maybe I look for hope in these situations. Again, that kind of ethic of care pervading urban life in a way that wasn't true before. So that's the hopeful option that I see.
I agree a lot with what Winifred was saying. Back to Barcelona, it seems as this pandemic could stop these gentrification processes, at least its expansion, taking into account that this gentrification spot was getting larger and larger since 2015. It even reached areas, poor areas, such as La Sagrera or Candalarpa Clot. It seems as with the flu pandemic would have stopped these processes. But there are people who are still resisting to keep paying these high rentals in some areas. People making huge efforts to keep paying these high rents. In many housings, all this income have extraordinarily diminished, and even though they could have resisted in the past in these gentrified areas, the pull of the system or the lack of employment have made them more vulnerable. It is true that some of the rentals are decreasing in some areas, and this can be helpful. But once again, there are many questions to be answered. We will have to see what's happening with the housing policies, municipal housing policies, and the prices of the market. Very last question. Diego Jesus Maldonado is asking you, do you think that the third sector in the areas of the country can decrease the negative effects of gentrification on women?
Yes, definitely. I think there's a huge role that there's so many things really we can do about this. It's just a matter of having the political will to do it. First of all, looking at, I think that's why this session is so important, because first, in order to solve a problem, we have to acknowledge that it exists. And that's something that simply isn't happening in too many cities, right? It's really lovely to see it happening in Barcelona, because I'm zooming in from Chicago today, and I can tell you it is not a part of the conversation at all. It is simply absent, right? So that's really the first thing, is just to acknowledge that it exists. And then to acknowledge that fixing it helps everybody, right? So this isn't just about, gender discrimination is not just a women's issue. It's an everybody issue, right? Because those single heads of household are raising children of both genders, of all genders, right? They are taking care of the elderly of all genders. So helping, removing that layer of discrimination will make everyone's life better, right? So working on that at every level, right? From how we are teaching children about gender in schools, to our assumptions about, to quite literally, when it comes to cities, who is doing the planning, right? And it's still, I hope it's better in Barcelona than it is here. It looks to be, but our planning departments in American cities, for example, are still overwhelmingly dominated by men, and specifically white men. And so issues that they can't plan for, issues that they themselves haven't experienced and don't realize are issues, right? So we really have to kind of percolate this through everything, right? Through non-governmental organizations paying attention to gender, to the way we represent what people, those gendered roles on television and in film. And, it really is kind of, we need a social revolution to get this done. So there are certainly individual policies that I think would help. So, as I mentioned, focusing on social housing and providing good childcare that's accessible to everybody. But this really does require a change at every single level. So like no aspect of society can be left out of how we think about these issues, which again is obviously no easy task. But I think that's how we have to think about it, that it really is everything, right? Our assumptions are so deeply built into us, and we have to actively go about the business of tearing down those assumptions.
I think it is difficult to add something more after Winifred's words, right? Okay, very well. So I want to thank you all. Thank you for your questions, for your contributions. It has been an intense debate, and I hope this debate will be presential. We will be able to be on site sometimes. This video will be put in English and in Catalan. I want to thank our speakers and our participants, our attendees. Thank you to Laia Grau, the Urban Development Director, to whom I give the floor for the closing session. Thank you, Laia. Thanks to our reporters for your superb presentations. You put a lot of science on your speeches. You both talked about gender, about the present and the future. Thanks to the municipal department for inviting me to talk. Gender is a center element. Thanks to our reporters for your surveys and for your data, because all these suspicions that we had about gentrification, about data, all this is helping us to build our municipal indicators. I am a woman, and behind there are many other women, as well as these white men, to whom it is difficult to introduce some urban policies. Some of them don't understand this mixed society. And if we tell them about gentrification and gender, that seems rocket science to some of these men. So I want to thank you again, because this daily business that we all have sometimes prevent us to see things in clear. But It is important to have these gentrification plans to get this data so we can move forward. Having said that, there is also this strong relationship between the income of women with housing. I think there are two policies we are trying to work on. They are quite complicated, but let's try to squeeze all that so we can find this balance of users. I mean, so there are no evictions. Let's try to regulate these users of soil, these uses of public spaces, so everyone can benefit from the public space. There are also urban planning. I mean, all what is being built, we are going to pass an urban document about 200 hectares. All the housing will be protected housing. If we link it with gender gentrification, it is all strongly linked. All these people who are more fragile vis-à-vis gentrification, these single mother households, as well as single elder households, which are the weakest. So through this protected housing, this can help us to fight this discrimination, to fight this loneliness from the elder, from the poorest people. So these low income houses and low income households can keep going forward and keep living in a safe neighborhood, in a safe city. So we're going to work to help fight against gentrification. We have to do things better. I want to thank you all again. I want to thank Toni López as well as Winifred Curran. Let's keep working then.